What's up everyone, it's the Law School Lumberjack. It is stifling hot in my apartment, so I apologize if I look sweaty right now. Today we are going to talk about the doctrine of undue influence. So, as I said in my video on unconscionability, the biggest part of the doctrines that I'm going to go through, both unconscionability and undue influence, and then also economic duress, the biggest part of that is to actually spot them, be able to apply the test, and then be able to, apply them in a law school exam. The case law is very important that you know the case law and are able to apply certain facts, but I think the best marginal benefit would come from me explaining the general rule, the tests surrounding the doctrines, and then kind of how to apply them on a law school exam. So as of right now, I won't be doing case briefs, but if my viewers comment on my videos and ask for specific case briefs or ask me to provide those case briefs, I'm more than happy to do so. So feel free to comment if those case briefs would interest you. So what is undue influence? So undue influence is essentially someone taking advantage of a fiduciary or a trust relationship. So the courts have basically come up with a two-part test. Step one of the test is the plaintiff has to prove that the relationship was such that undue influence could be a factor in the creation of the contract. So if you have a situation where the courts have held that that relationship in the past can lead to undue influence, you've passed this test. So things like fiduciary relationships, doctor-patient relationships, lawyer-client relationships, all of those types of fiduciary relationships, you pass this test. Now, if the courts haven't held that the relationship in question is an established category, you're not dead in the water. You just basically have to prove to the court that the relationship was such that undue influence would be possible. One of the ways to do that is to establish that there was an ad hoc fiduciary relationship or a relationship that amounted to a fiduciary relationship. Basically what you need is a situation where one party, I'm simplifying this, but essentially one party is giving trust to another party and is relying on that party's expertise and advice. So once the established relationship is proven, so once step one is proved, then the onus shifts to the non-vulnerable party, or usually the defendant, to prove that the contract was entered into by the vulnerable person out of their own free will. Now, this is a bit of an interesting test because people are probably wondering, how do I prove what someone thought when they entered into a contract? And how do I prove that it was through free will? So this is what you'll see a lot of times in a law school exam. It might be difficult to gather the facts to prove that, maybe the defendant or the non-vulnerable party, didn't unduly influence. Like, what facts are important? So some of the facts that are important or are pertinent to your law school fact pattern might be, is there a certificate of independent legal advice? Was a lawyer involved for both sides? In those sort of circumstances, you can make a good case that, because everyone had representation, there wasn't a situation where there was undue influence. Additionally, you might consider things such as, was there substantial benefit to the vulnerable party? Right? If you have a situation where the vulnerable party sells an item, gets the fair market value, it's less likely that would lead to a situation where there was no free will. By contrast, take a situation where the vulnerable party, let's say being an elderly parent, sells their home to their child in exchange for their love and affection and $1. That might raise more red flags and suggest that that parent isn't negotiating out of their own free will. Now, you could still have a situation where the facts can show that there was free will, but situations where you have an unfair advantage or fair market value isn't being paid, that's more likely that undue influence could arguably affect the contract. So finally, let's kind of talk about what you should look for in a law school exam. I kind of talked about the facts you should look for, but let's talk about what situation should cause you to have a bit of a red flag and say, maybe this is undue influence. So the archetypical undue influence cases usually come up in estate law. What usually happens is, in undue influence cases, is you have an adult child and a very elderly parent. And that adult child then takes advantage of their elderly parent who they're supposed to be taking care of. But it isn't just constrained to the estate realm. You see undue influence cases basically where anytime you can have a trust relationship. So as I said, firstly, if you have an established category and there's a transaction directly between two parties where there's a clear vulnerable party and a party who's not vulnerable, then you might be thinking undue influence is possible, especially when that relationship involves some sort of fiduciary relationship. The other thing that you should keep in mind is you don't need a direct contract between two people for there to be undue influence. So what I mean by this is, on a law school exam, if you see a situation where, either a husband and wife or adult child and their parent are going into a bank and one is guaranteeing a loan for the other, let's say for a small business, for example, or they're guaranteeing a mortgage, in those situations, you might be thinking maybe this is undue influence, because what happens there is, one party, usually the non-vulnerable party, is getting a benefit, and the vulnerable party is taking on liability with arguably no benefit. So again, it's not automatically undue influence. In those situations, especially with husband and wife, it's probably not an established category, so you're going to have to prove that there was some sort of trust relationship there. In fact scenarios like that, your mind should be going towards, maybe this is undue influence. In any event, I hope this is helpful. If this video was, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Take care. See you next time.